Today we are going to talk about fiscal policy. So the Keynesian theory of macro instability practically mandates government intervention if aggregate demand, which we can say total spending in the economy, is too little, unemployment arises because there is not enough production in the economy, so the companies do not want to hire people for more production. If total spending or aggregate demand is too much, inflation arises. What does that mean? People spend more than the economy can produce, so that this is going to be reflected in the prices. Prices are going to increase, so there's going to be an inflation. If the market cannot correct these imbalances, then the federal government must. So actually, fiscal policy is all about it. In this chapter, we examine fiscal policy tools. The core issues are: can government spending and tax policies ensure full employment? What policy actions will help fight inflation? What are the risks of government intervention? So the definition of fiscal policy is the use of government taxes and spending to alter macroeconomic outcomes. Let's first define taxes and spending. The federal government collects nearly $3 trillion a year in tax revenues, nearly half of which comes from individual income taxes. Less than half of government expenditures go to government purchases of goods and services. The rest are income transfers. So we should define first what is income transfer. Income transfers are the payments to individuals for which no current goods or services are exchanged. So make it simple in your mind. The first thing is, you know what is government spending. Government spending is building roads. National defense is a government spending. Tax cut, you know what's a tax cut. So if there is a tax cut, you have more available income in your pocket for spending. Income transfers, you may think income transfers as social security checks. Why? Because the government is paying you social security checks but not expecting to buy goods and services from you. So fiscal policy is a combination of these three policy tools. These tax and spending powers can greatly influence the aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the total spending in the economy. Government can alter aggregate demand by purchasing more or fewer goods and services, raising or lowering taxes, changing the level of income transfers. So government has three policy tools to change or alter the aggregate. Fiscal policy goals. First, we will explore the fiscal policy's potential to ensure full employment. Second, we will explore fiscal policy's potential to maintain price stability. Let's start with the fiscal stimulus. If there is a recessionary GDP gap exists, a fiscal stimulus could be used to deliver the economy to full employment. Let me show you here. The economy is an aggregate demand curve 1. AD1, okay, you see it here, and this intersection point is represented as A, and at that point the real GDP amount is 5.6 trillion, okay, and this economy, if produces with full capacity, can be able to produce $6 trillion of real GDP, okay. So we want the economy to be at full employment, which is 6 trillion. We want the economy to produce $6 trillion of goods and services. However, this economy is only producing 5.6. So there's going to be a recessionary GDP gap. What does that mean? There's going to be an unemployment because the economy is not producing 0.4 trillion goods and services. There's going to be as much as that output value. There's going to be an unemployment. So what the government can actually do fiscal stimulus by using its policy tools. What are the policy tools? Tax cuts, spending increases, or increases in transfer payments. So by doing that, actually what the government is trying to do, let me show you. So as you remember, aggregate demand curve is equal to consumption spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus net exports. So what government is trying to do is since the aggregate demand curve is not at the point that we wants to increase this government spending. If government spending by tax cut, increase in spending, or increase in transfer payments increases the aggregate demand curve, what is going to happen? The aggregate demand curve is going to shift to the right. So shifting to the right means the total spending in the economy increases. Let's continue on aggregate shortfall. Okay. The aggregate demand shortfall actually is the amount of output level we have to increase, spending level we have to increase, so that the economy is going to be at full employment level. As you see from the graph, aggregate supply curve slopes upward, so an aggregate demand shift right will induce price level increases. Since prices increases, the amount of output that is going to be sold to ensure the full employment level will not be reached. The fiscal stimulus needed to close the GDP gap must be larger than the gap. So where is the gap? Let me show you where is the gap. This is my gap here. Okay, the amount of the gap is $0.4 trillion of GDP. But the fiscal stimulus needed to ensure that we are in the full employment level, which point D is going to be larger than the recessionary GDP gap because the aggregate supply curve slopes upward. If you just increase the total spending as much as the gap, you will end up at point C. This is the gap, the amount of gap. Let me show you. You increase that much aggregate demand curve, you end up at a point C. So at this point C, you'll realize that we are not reaching the full employment level. So we should increase the total spending more than the GDP gap. And let's show how much it should be. This is the amount of fiscal stimulus we should do in order to increase the GDP level at full employment level. So aggregate shortfall is the amount of additional aggregate demand needed to achieve full employment after allowing for price level changes. It is represented by the distance between the point A and point E. So it is actually our fiscal target. So we should target to increase total spending as much as the aggregate demand shortfall. So let's start using our policy tools. The first one is government spending. Increased government spending is a form of fiscal stimulus. All new government spending will have a multiplied impact on aggregate demand. The multiplier effect will stimulate additional rounds of increased consumer spending. So let's remember from Chapter 10. Here we have a multiplier in the economy. What is multiplier? Multiplier is actually 1 over 1 minus marginal propensity to consume. Let's say in this American economy, we have a marginal propensity to consume 0.75, and the multiplier for this economy will be 1 over 1 minus 0.75. If you do this calculation, you'll realize that multiplier is going to be 4. So what does that mean if the multiplier is 4? If there is an increase in total spending amount $100 billion, it may come from consumption, investment, or government spending, the total spending will increase 4 times 100, $400 billion. So desired fiscal stimulus, how we can find the desired fiscal stimulus, because we don't want to make a mistake. too little or too much, the economy, if you do too little fiscal stimulus, the economy may stay in recession. If you do too much fiscal stimulus, this may rapidly lead to excessive spending and inflation. We can use this formula to estimate how much fiscal stimulus needed. Desired fiscal stimulus is equal to aggregate demand shortfall divided by multiplier. Let me show you. Let's say in that economy, the quantity equilibrium is $5.6 trillion of GDP. And we want to be at full employment level, which is 6 trillion. And aggregate demand shortfall is equal to 0.8 trillion. And the multiplier in this economy is 4. So the desired fiscal stimulus is going to be aggregate demand shortfall divided by multiplier, which is 0.2 trillion. So the government should increase $200 billion in order to close the gap of $0.4 trillion. The second policy tool that the government can do is tax cut. The fiscal stimulus can come from inducing increased autonomous consumption or investment spending. Government can do this by lowering taxes. Individual income tax cut, disposable income would increase, causing increased consumption, spending, or corporate tax cut, profits would increase, spurring increased investment spending. But there is a difference between government spending and tax cut. A tax cut adds no more dollars to the economy. It allows earners to keep more of their current pre-tax income. How much additional consumer spending is controlled by the size of the marginal propensity to consume. So here, initial increase in consumption is going to be determined by marginal propensity to consume times the tax cut. And cumulative change in spending is going to be multiplier times the initial consumption. Since there is no initial new input of spending, a tax cut contains less fiscal stimulus than a government spending increase of the same size. The initial spending injection can be less than the size of the tax cut. Let me show you here. So in the previous example, we know that the aggregate demand shortfall, AD shortfall, is equal to 0.8 trillion. Okay, and we know that the desired fiscal stimulus is going to be 0.8 divided by multiplier 4, which is 0.2 trillion, okay, which is equal to actually trillion is equal to $200 billion. Now the next thing is we want to know actually how much of this has to come from the tax cut. If I want a desired fiscal stimulus of $200 billion, what I need to do is I need to find the tax cut is equal to desired fiscal stimulus divided by marginal propensity to consume. Okay, so if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, you have to do 200 divided by 0.75. So this will give you how much tax cut you should do in order to have the desired fiscal stimulus. The third one is the increased transfer. This is the third policy tool. Increasing transfer payments raises recipients' disposable income and spending increases. The effect is much like a tax cut since the recipients will save some of the pay. And we look at the fiscal stimulus, but on the other hand, we should think about fiscal restraint because we don't always have the recessionary GDP gap problem in the economy. An inflationary GDP gap is the second problem. If an inflationary GDP gap exists, the fiscal restraint could be used to return the economy to full employment GDP. Fiscal restraint, tax hikes, or spending cuts intended to decrease the aggregate demand. That is, shift aggregate demand to the left. So here, the idea is in the reverse direction. Now we have too much total spending that creates an inflation in the economy, and we want to restrain the total spending. We want to shift the aggregate demand to the left so that we can be able to reach the full employment level. In this example, as you see, the inflationary GDP gap is around $0.2 trillion of output. And we want to take this total spending to $6 trillion, which is full employment level. So we have excess aggregate demand. How excess it is, because if we know that how much we need to shift the aggregate demand curve, then we can be able to easily define how much fiscal restraint, desired fiscal restraint in the economy should be. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply slopes upward, so an aggregate demand shift left will induce price level decreases. The fiscal restraint needed to close the GDP gap must be larger than the gap. Aggregate demand excess is the amount by which aggregate demand must be reduced to achieve full employment after allowing for price level changes. It is represented by the distance between point Q1 and point Q2, and it's our fiscal target. Let me show you how much is the fiscal target. This is our fiscal target. What we want this aggregate demand to move to aggregate demand 2, but as you see, at given prices, the fiscal restraint should be as much as the aggregate demand excess. Okay. So desired fiscal restraint, too little fiscal restraint, the economy may continue to be inflationary. Too much fiscal restraint, this may rapidly lead to decreased spending and rising unemployment. We can use this formula to estimate how much fiscal restraint is needed. Aggregate demand excess divided by multiplier is going to give you the desired fiscal restraint. Same idea, instead of aggregate demand shortfall, we have aggregate demand excess. Budget cuts, decreased government spending is a form of fiscal restraint. Reduced government spending will have a multiplied impact on aggregate demand. The multiplier effect will generate additional negative rounds of decreased consumer spending. So horizontal shift in aggregate demand or excess aggregate demand is going to be multiplier times the fiscal restraint. Cut government expenditures to initiate a multiplier process to achieve the desired fiscal restraint. For example, decreased military spending would cause layoffs at defense plants. Incomes would decrease and consumer spending would also decrease, triggering the negative multiplier rounds. The second policy tool is tax hikes. The direct effect of a tax hike is reduced disposable income. People must reduce consumption and saving to pay their taxes. This will trigger the negative multiplier effect. Aggregate demand will shift to the left. And the third policy tool is reduced transfers. If transfer payments decrease, recipients' disposable income falls and spending decreases. The effect is much like a tax hike. This option is politically unpopular. Let's see as a whole. This is the summary. Let's start with the macro problem of weak economy, unemployment. Policy target is we want to make a fiscal stimulus that can shift the aggregate demand curve as much as the aggregate demand shortfall. And desired fiscal stimulus can be always defined by aggregate demand shortfall divided by multiplier. We have three policy tools. The first one is increase government purchases. Increase government purchases as much as the desired fiscal stimulus. The second policy tool is cut taxes. Cut the taxes not as much as desired fiscal stimulus, but by more than desired fiscal stimulus, because consumers are not going to spend all their disposable income. Some of them they spend. So the cut taxes as much as the desired fiscal stimulus divided by marginal propensity to consume. The same is true for increased transfers. Increased transfers more than desired fiscal stimulus, or equal to desired fiscal stimulus divided by marginal propensity to consume. The second problem is overheated economy, inflation. Policy target is the aggregate demand excess. So you want to decrease the aggregate demand as much as the aggregate demand excess. Policy strategies, fiscal restraint, shifting the aggregate demand bill to the left. Desired fiscal restraint can be found always aggregate demand excess divided by multiplier. We have three policies. The first, reduce government purchases. Reduce government purchases as much as the desired fiscal restraint. The second policy option is increase taxes. Increase the taxes not as much as the desired fiscal restraint because consumers are not always spending all the tax cuts that they have. So the increase the taxes more than desired fiscal restraint or equal to desired fiscal restraint divided by marginal propensity to consume. And the third option is similar to increased taxes, reduce transfer payments as much as the desired fiscal restraint divided by marginal propensity to consume. Fiscal guidelines. The goal of fiscal policy is to eliminate GDP gaps by shifting aggregate demand. How much to shift is indicated by the aggregate demand shortfall or the aggregate demand excess. The size of the fiscal initiative is equal to the desired shift divided by the multiplier. What remains is to decide which policy to use. So we have one problem with the government spending, which is crowding out. Crowding out, a reduction in private sector borrowing and spending caused by increased government borrowing. A fiscal stimulus would most likely to be financed by government borrowing. Less credit becomes available to the private sector, which must reduce its borrowing and spending. This private sector spending reduction offsets the government spending, reducing the impact of fiscal stimulus. Fiscal policy problems, time lags. It takes time to recognize that a problem exists, develop a policy strategy, pass the required legislation, implement a policy, generate the many steps in the multiplier process. So this may take months. Other impacts on the economy may have occurred before the impact of the policy takes place. And also we have pork barrel politics. Congress members might channel spending to their own districts, protect favored projects from cuts, steer away from tax hikes or spending cuts before an election. These political moves can alter the content and timing of the fiscal. And finally, two camps have emerged. One camp favors government solution to problems. The other camp is concerned about excessively large government and asserts that solutions are better left to the private sector. If government is divided between the two groups, fiscal policy will be delayed by arguments on these policy issues. One camp favors government solutions to problems. They would increase government spending to cover an aggregate demand shortfall. They would hike taxes to cover an aggregate demand excess. The other camp is concerned about excessively large government and thinks that solutions are better left to the private sector. They would cut taxes to cover an aggregate demand shortfall. They would reduce government spending to cover an aggregate demand excess. So that's the end of chapter 11. We are going to look at banks, money and bank in the following chapter.